There are questions that seem harmless on the surface, even polite, even conversational. But underneath the words, something else is happening. The question is not really a question. It is a probe, a test, a way to gather information that can later be used to influence, pressure, or predict your behavior. Most people assume manipulation looks obvious. They imagine threats, aggression, or direct pressure. But real-world influence rarely starts there. It starts with information gathering. It starts with patterns. It starts with small answers that feel insignificant in the moment, but become valuable later, when they are connected together. The human brain is designed to answer questions automatically. When someone asks you something, your default instinct is to respond. It feels socially correct. It feels cooperative. That instinct is what makes certain questioning patterns so powerful. Because you are not just giving answers. You are giving access. And access is everything. There are 5 types of questions you should never answer too quickly. And in some cases, not at all, without understanding what is really being asked underneath the surface. The first type is what we can call value extraction questions. These are questions that appear casual, but are designed to map what you care about most. For example, what's the most important thing in your life right now? Who do you trust the most? What would you never want to lose? On the surface, these seem like normal conversational questions. But psychologically, they do something very specific. They reveal your priority structure. And once someone understands your priority structure, they understand your pressure points. People don't need to threaten what you care about if they know exactly what it is. They just need to understand it. Because once something is defined as important by you, it becomes usable as leverage, even in subtle ways. For example, if someone knows your highest priority is family, then emotional influence can be applied through family-related framing. If someone knows your highest priority is stability, then uncertainty becomes a tool of influence. If someone knows your highest priority is approval, then praise and withdrawal become tools of control. Most people never realize they have revealed their internal hierarchy until it is already being used against them. The second type of question is what we can call identity confirmation questions. These sound like, "You're a loyal person, right? You wouldn't lie to me, would you? You're not the type of person who gives up easily, correct?" At first glance, these feel like compliments or harmless assumptions. But something important is happening underneath. These questions are not asking for information. They are placing a label on you and asking you to accept it. And once you accept a label about yourself, especially in a social context, your behavior begins to align with it. This is called identity pressure. It works because humans are highly motivated to remain consistent with how they describe themselves publicly. So if you say, "Yes, I'm a loyal person," you have now created internal pressure to act in accordance with that label, even when later situations may require boundaries, disagreement, or refusal. This is how subtle manipulation works. It does not force behavior. It defines identity, then lets identity do the work. The third type of question is what we can call guilt-loading questions. These are emotionally structured questions designed to make refusal feel like wrongdoing. For example, "After everything I've done for you, you can't do this one thing? If I really mattered to you, would you say no? Do you even care about how this affects me?" These questions are powerful because they bypass logic and go directly into emotional regional. Notice something important. The actual request is often simple, but the framing turns it into a moral test. If you say yes, you comply at your own expense. If you say no, you feel like you are harming the relationship. That emotional trap is intentional in many cases. It removes neutral ground. You are no longer deciding based on your needs. You are deciding based on guilt pressure. And guilt is one of the most reliable compliance drivers in human behavior. The fourth type of question is what we can call boundary probing questions. These are questions that test how easily your limits can be shifted. They often sound like, "Just this once, what's the big deal? Why are you being so strict about this? Can't you make an exception for me?" These questions are not about the specific situation. They are about testing flexibility. Because boundaries are not usually broken in one moment. They are slowly negotiated downward over time. Each "just this once" becomes the next expectation. Each exception becomes precedent. Each compromise becomes the new baseline. The person asking these questions is often not consciously thinking in terms of manipulation, but the behavioral outcome is the same. They are testing how much resistance exists around your limits. And every time a boundary shifts without consequence, it weakens. The fifth type of question is the most subtle and often the most dangerous. Information triangulation questions. These are questions that involve third parties, indirect comparisons, or social pressure. For example, what would your friends think about this? Do your parents know you're doing this? Everyone else agrees with me. Don't you think that means something? These questions are powerful because they shift authority away from you and toward a stored, perceived group consensus. Instead of you evaluating the situation directly, you are being asked to filter your decision through external judgment. This creates social pressure without direct force. Humans are wired to avoid social rejection. So when a question suggests that others are watching, or others will judge, decision-making becomes influenced by imagined perception rather than internal clarity. This is one of the oldest forms of influence. It does not require authority. It only requires the suggestion of consensus. Now, something important needs to be understood about all 5 of these question types. They are not always used maliciously. A friend can ask a value question out of curiosity. A partner can ask identity questions as affection. A family member can ask guilt-based questions without realizing the emotional weight. A colleague can test boundaries without conscious manipulation. And social comparison questions are common in everyday conversation. The issue is not always intent. The issue is pattern and repetition. Because when these questions are used repeatedly in the same relationship dynamic, something shifts. Information becomes asymmetrical. One person begins to understand the internal structure of the other person more deeply than they understand themselves. And that asymmetry creates influence potential. That is where awareness becomes critical. Because the goal is not to become paranoid of every question. The goal is to recognize when questioning is being used to extract, redirect, or shape behavior rather than simply understand you. One of the strongest indicators is how you feel after certain conversations. Do you feel clarified or confused? Do you feel grounded or emotionally pressured? Do you feel like you freely chose your answer, or like your answer was guided by emotional tension? Your internal state often reveals more than the words themselves. Another important layer is pacing. Manipulative questioning is often fast, layered, or emotionally loaded. Questions come one after another without space for reflection. This reduces critical thinking and increases automatic response. Healthy communication allows space. It allows pause. It allows thought. Pressure removes that space. Another indicator is repetition of themes. If certain questions keep appearing in slightly different forms, it is often not curiosity. It is mapping. Mapping is the process of building a psychological profile through incremental questioning. What you fear. What you value. What you will tolerate. What you will justify. What you will forgive. What you will ignore. Once that map is complete, influence becomes significantly easier. Not because force is used, but because prediction becomes possible. Behavior becomes easier to guide when it is predictable. This is why awareness of questioning patterns is not about fear. It is about clarity. When you understand how information is gathered, you are less likely to give away internal structure without realizing it. One of the simplest protective habits is slowing down responses. Not every question requires immediate answer. Not every emotional prompt requires explanation. Not every personal detail needs to be shared in real time. Pause creates space. Space creates awareness. Awareness restores choice. Because ultimately, the power of these question types does not come from the questions themselves. It comes from automatic answering. When response becomes conscious instead of automatic, the influence loop breaks. And at that point, the conversation shifts. Instead of being guided, it becomes evaluated. Instead of being reactive, it becomes intentional. Instead of revealing structure unconsciously, it becomes selective about what is shared and when it is shared. And that shift alone changes the entire dynamic of interaction, because once a person begins to recognize the difference between a genuine question and a structured psychological probe, they no longer respond from instinct alone, but from awareness. And awareness is where control over influence begins to return. I can continue, but I'll keep it meaningful, rather than just stretching the same ideas. Once you reach this level of awareness, something important starts to change in how you experience conversations. You begin to notice that not every question deserves the same emotional weight. Some questions are simply informational, others are directional, and a smaller number are structural. They are designed, consciously or not, to influence how you think, decide, or relate. At first, this awareness can feel uncomfortable, because it makes you more conscious of social dynamics that most people operate through automatically. But over time, it creates stability instead of paranoia. You stop reacting blindly, and you start responding selectively. One of the key shifts is learning that you are allowed to delay answers. Most people are trained socially to respond immediately. Silence is often interpreted as awkward or suspicious, but in reality, silence is where clarity forms. When someone asks a loaded question, the first response that appears in your mind is often emotional, not logical. That emotional response is exactly what certain questioning styles rely on. But when you introduce a pause, even a short one, you interrupt that automatic pathway. You begin to see the structure behind the question instead of just the surface content. For example, when a question triggers urgency, "Answer me right now," or "I need to know immediately," that urgency itself becomes information, because genuine curiosity can tolerate reflection. Pressure often cannot. Another important shift is recognizing when a question assumes agreement before you respond. These are subtle setups. The question is not neutral. It already contains an expectation. You agree this is unfair, right? You can see why I had to do it, can't you? You wouldn't want to make this harder than it needs to be, would you? Each of these is not asking for your perspective. It is guiding you toward a pre-structured conclusion. If you answer without noticing that structure, you are already operating inside a frame you did not choose. Once you begin noticing framing, you start reclaiming mental space. Another layer that becomes clearer over time is emotional loading inside questions. Some questions are not meant to gather truth. They are designed to create discomfort. Why are you like this? What's wrong with you? Do you even realize how you sound? These are not curiosity-based questions. They are identity-targeted statements disguised as questions. And the psychological effect is that they push the person being asked into defending themselves rather than examining whether the question itself is valid. Defense is a reactive state, and reactive states reduce clarity. This is why one of the most powerful skills in communication is learning not to accept the frame of a question automatically. Sometimes the healthiest response is not an answer, but a clarification of intent. What are you trying to understand with that question? That single shift forces the conversation back into clarity instead of assumption. Another important realization is that not all information requests are equal. Some questions are building understanding. Others are building leverage. Understanding-based questions sound open-ended. They allow for explanation. They do not rush toward conclusions. Leverage-based questions, on the other hand, often feel slightly invasive or unusually specific. They focus on details that can later be recalled, reframed, or used in argument. What exactly did you say to them? Who was there with you? What time did that happen? On their own, none of these are suspicious. But in pattern, they can reveal an intent to map events in a way that can later be reconstructed, for influence or challenge. This is why awareness is not about rejecting questions. It is about recognizing accumulation. A single question means very little. A pattern of questioning reveals direction, and direction is what matters. Another subtle dynamic involves emotional timing. Certain questions are asked when emotional states are already heightened, during conflict, stress, or vulnerability. In those moments, cognitive filtering is reduced. People are more likely to respond quickly, less likely to analyze, and more likely to accept framing without resistance. This is why some conversations feel heavier than others, even if the words are simple. Timing changes impact. A question asked in calm context is processed differently than the same question asked during emotional tension. As awareness increases, you begin to notice that influence is not always about content. It is about timing, framing, repetition, and emotional state. These layers combined create what can be described as conversational architecture. Once you see that structure, you can no longer fully unsee it. But the purpose of seeing it is not to withdraw from communication. It is to participate more consciously. Because when you understand how questions shape responses, you also gain the ability to shape your own responses with intention, rather than reflex. You begin to choose when to answer fully, when to answer partially, when to ask a question back, and when to simply not engage with the framing at all. This is where communication becomes balanced again. Not reactive, not automatic, but deliberate. And in that deliberate space, the influence of manipulative questioning weakens significantly, because influence requires participation. Without automatic participation, the structure collapses into just words without leverage, and at that point, the person regains the ability to think clearly, respond calmly, and decide based on their own internal evaluation rather than externally imposed pressure.